Brian Richardson is a proud 1973 alumnus of Washington and Lee. He is a professor and the head of Washington and Lee's Department of Journalism and Mass Communications. He holds a Master's in Communications and the Ph.D. in Mass Communications from the University of Florida. Before coming to Washington and Lee, he has worked for local television and radio stations in Virginia and in Florida, and as a reporter and editor for the Tallahassee Democrat, the Miami Herald, and the Philadelphia Inquirer for more than 10 years. He's covered local government, courts, urban affairs, and education. Here at W&L, he has taught reporting, journalism ethics, and state and local government. His research and scholarly interests include journalism ethics, the role of the news media in subnational governance, and the news media. He is the author of the textbook, The Process of Writing News, From Information to Story. Brian, I will turn the program over to you. Thank you very much, and you can introduce our distinguished guest.
Thank you, Bo. Well, good afternoon. Thank you all for coming. And to our alumni, I extend a warm welcome back. It's good to see you. That the New York Times had offered a new round of buyouts to its newsroom journalists. The paper has to eliminate 100 more jobs. If fewer than that number of journalists opt for the buyouts, the paper will make up the difference with layoffs. This news should resonate with all of us for three reasons. First, as citizens, we're all concerned with what happens to a democracy should the widespread availability of news fail. Second, our guest today, Alex Jones, is the author of the recently released Losing the News, The Future of the News That Feeds Democracy. This book, and I can't resist a plug on Alex's behalf. It will be for sale out in the lobby afterwards, and I think Alex will be available for some signing.
It's a great Christmas present.
If you've got a big stocking, it'll fit right in. And third, Alex is an alumnus not only of Washington and Lee, but of the New York Times, where he won the Pulitzer Prize 22 years ago. The Times announcement is symptomatic, I think, of the challenges facing a calling that is dealing with both a severe recession and a sea change in its delivery system, economic model, and the ways in which audiences access news. Any of these would be daunting by itself. As simultaneous events, they threaten our core mission and very survival. If there is good news in all of this, it is that very smart, dedicated people are taking a long look at news and how we can emerge from these dark hours with something more resilient, tougher, and better. Alex S. Jones, class of '68, is one of our nation's most visible and cogent observers and commentators on the news business. That is not entirely surprising to those of us who know his pedigree. He came to Washington and Lee from a newspaper family. For 4 generations, they have owned and run the Greenville Sun in Tennessee. It pains me that Alex did not major in journalism at Washington and Lee. I believe the history department sneered you, is that right? But he seems not to have let that disadvantage impede his rise to the top of his profession. He covered the press for the New York Times from 1983 until 1982, winning the Pulitzer Prize in 1987 for his coverage of the demise of the Bingham family and its ownership of the Louisville Courier-Journal. That coverage led to co-authorship with his wife, Susan Tift, of 2 books, The Patriarch, The Rise and Fall of the Bingham Dynasty, and The Trust, the private and powerful family behind the New York Times. The latter was a finalist for the National Book Critics Circle Award. For the past 8 years, I guess going on 9 now probably.
9 years, yes.
9 years. Alex has been director of Harvard's Shorenstein Center on the Press, Politics, and Public Policy. Many of you also know that a couple of years ago, Alex was presented a Distinguished Alumnus Award by W&L, and last June, by vote of the trustees, Alex and Susan were both awarded honorary W&L degrees. Alex, welcome, and thank you so much for being with us today.
Brian, I am delighted to be here. Thank you. Thank you. I had the very happy experience this morning on this beautiful fall day of taking a kind of sentimental walk around Lexington and Washington and Lee. And I want to clear a couple of things up. First of all, the reason I did not major in journalism and took no courses in journalism and did not work for the Ring Tum 5 when I was at Washington and Lee was that I was in full rebellion flight mode from my family's multi-generational newspaper business. Some of you may have had similar experiences if you came from family businesses. I was trying very hard not to do anything that would compel me to go back and do what my parents very much wanted me to do, which of course I ended up doing anyway, which was going into the newspaper business. I did do one article, or series of articles actually, for the Ring Tum 5 about the problems that Washington and Lee was having at the moment with its library. And I remember this vividly because the professor, Al Mosier, some of you may remember him, he was the faculty member in charge of the library, and he became apoplectic at these articles, and I think referred to me in language, I'm told, that couldn't appear in the New York Times. Let me put it that way. The other thing, though, that I want to mention to you, and I see some of you here are members of the student body at Washington and Lee, and some of you are more like me, former members of the student body of Washington and Lee. And I remember something very vividly from my junior year, the spring of my junior year. Just as this is a beautiful fall day, this was a beautiful spring day in the spring of 1967, and I was going up the hill toward the colonnade. I think I had a lab or something. And I remember vividly walking up the walk toward Lee Chapel from the parking lot there. It was one of those glorious Shenandoah Valley spring days. And I remember vividly thinking, suddenly, it was like a thunderclap. And the words that crossed my mind were, oh my God, in another year, they're going to make me leave. That's absolute truth. And I have found my way back here repeatedly over the years. It's a place that I revere and a place that I feel taught me a lot in an awful lot of different areas. I think our sort of format today is that Brian is we're going to have a conversation about the book. Let me just give you a very brief sense of what my objective was in writing this book. This book was written not for journalists, although I think journalists, some of them have benefited from reading it because it's reminded them of some things, which I think we journalists, and I consider myself really to be a journalist, not an academic, need to be reminded of. We're going through, as I'm sure you know very well, a very tumultuous time in the news media business, and with the news media, and with what I have called in this book the iron core of news, which is in jeopardy. The iron core, by my definition, being the serious reported news on serious topics, not Britney Spears and not sports and not opinion pages, but things like politics and policy, wars, city hall, state legislatures, things like that. Things that are the kinds of news reporting that we need if we're going to be effectively a self-governing people. And we need to have done by people who will report the news instead of simply giving their opinions about it or giving a kind of a version of what's going on in these places from an advocacy point of view. That's my definition of the iron core. This is a kind of news, accountability news, that holds power accountable, that has been done for the most part by newspapers, overwhelmingly, in fact, by newspapers. My estimate is about 85%. And as newspapers are facing these terrible difficulties because of the digital revolution and now because of the economic climate, even newspapers like the New York Times, as Brian described, are having to do things that are inevitably going to undermine their ability to do the job with the kind of depth and excess that is needed. By that excess, I mean that news reporting is not an efficient business, usually. It often requires people to not spend their time necessarily working like mad every minute of every day. But it requires having people who have expertise and are given time to do the kind of work that is the most important kind of work, the investigative journalism and the journalism that is rooted in both knowledge and experience and time to do the job correctly. I think that this story that I saw about the New York Times was disturbing to me. The New York Times is probably the biggest news operation still, and probably you can lose 100 people without anyone really noticing it. But it's still something that I hate to see happen. And one of the interesting elements of what has happened in response is that I'm told people have been responding to this news by telling the New York Times, readers of the New York Times, saying, don't do this, pushing back and saying, I don't want you to do this. This is my newspaper. I'm supporting you. I don't want you to undermine the quality by getting rid of your news staff, by whittling it down. I think that's a very important turn as well. The thing is that along with this jeopardy to this iron core of news is jeopardy to a whole array of values that have grown up along with the newspaper business and the traditional mainstream news culture in this country. The standard of objectivity, which I talk about in this book. The chapter is called Objectivity's Last Stand, and I think that that is really also the truth. I think it is under great fire under the situation we're in now, in part because of the culture of journalism and in part because of the economic situation that journalism is in. The issue of journalism ethics. Journalism ethics is something I know that some people sneer at the idea that there is such a thing as journalism ethics. But I can tell you that journalists probably worry more about ethical questions in public, more, as far as I can tell, than any other profession. I don't know of any other profession that puts its mistakes quite so prominently on display and does more of a public mea culpa about them than the news media. And that has led people to believe, I guess, that the news media are more prone to error, and maybe the news media are. But I think that the idea of how journalism ethics is construed and what is considered to be a violation of journalism ethics is now in play because of what's happening to news organizations in general. And also in play is the issue of the First Amendment, which many of you probably, like I think most Americans, take for granted and assume has always been the way it is now because it was part of the Bill of Rights. But it wasn't. It really wasn't. And I spend a chapter in this book talking about the fragile nature of the First Amendment and how in the First Amendment's first 170 years, it was something that did not protect you if you had a controversial thing to say at a difficult time. For instance, if you had expressed opposition to World War I, you could have gone to jail for it after war was declared. It was something that you were simply not allowed to do under the laws of our country, and the First Amendment was no protection. That's something that changed in large measure because of efforts by news organizations that were robust and were trying to expand the idea of a First Amendment that applied broadly to every element of the speech in our country and not just as it was interpreted until then as something that states and even localities could determine by simply passing a law that made something illegal to say in the newspaper of the town. And then we get to the issue of what's going to happen to news if it becomes something that is generated by upstart, well-meaning, nonprofit, online institutions. Now, that's something that I welcome because I think that what they're doing is making a contribution. But what I fear is that the institutional power that newspapers have had, which is very important for delivering information that is important and revelations that are important, I believe that that institutional power is also being undermined, and that institutional power is what has been behind the ability of news organizations to withstand pressure, deal with lawsuits, file freedom of information suits, and function in an environment when, if they're really doing their job, often the time when they're doing their job and it's most damagingly dangerous is when they are under the most pressure, and why these institutions need to have the muscularity and the financial strength to be able to withstand it. The book that I've written is aimed at people who are concerned about the news, people like you, who understand that the news is important, news is vital to our ability to govern ourselves, and are concerned about what they see. And it's calculated, I hope, to be not a boring treatise on this, but a story that explains what's important and why it's important, and finally what might be done about it. So with that, let me say, Brian, what do you have to say?
I don't know, maybe I'll just let you keep going. Actually, when I was reading the book and hearing you talk today, I felt like you were standing over our shoulders in our classes and watching what we try to reinforce with our students every day. And that was a good feeling, because to hear it come from someone of your stature and experience is reinforcing for us. But I wanted to push a little bit on a couple of things. And the first is, and you dwell on this a bit in the book, what you mean by a newspaper, because one of the things we deal with, and as I say, that you sort of address, is that there's a newspaper that is a printed product, that you plunk down your money for. You kill some trees, you plunk down your money for, and you read. There's a newspaper as a sort of function in a democratic society, and I'd like you to talk a little bit more about what you address in the book. Is that something that a printed product that you pick up and read every day, or are we talking about a newspaper as something that we need in a democratic society?
Well, my purpose in the book is not to save newspapers, but to save a form of news. But the reason newspapers are important, institutional, is because they have been, as I say, the generators of about 85% of that information. The way I look at what a newspaper is, though, is traditional in one sense. My grandmother got my family into the newspaper business in 1916 when she went down and took control of the smallest of 3 weekly newspapers in our little town of Greenville, Tennessee, which is in East Tennessee. And the prospects for this newspaper were not great. This was a heavily Republican county, and the name of the newspaper was the Greenville Democrat, if that gives you any sense. But my grandfather, this is kind of, for those of you who are Washington and Lee men, for the most part, will appreciate this. My grandfather had gone to the University of Virginia, and he had become an alcoholic while he was at the University of Virginia. He was a lawyer. At least that's the way it came down in my family. And I was told by my parents that I was not allowed to go to the University of Virginia because they drank there. Fortunately, at Washington and Lee, it was a different situation. Anyway, my grandmother really needed to support her family, and this was what she had to do it with. So she went down in 1916, took over this newspaper, and it was something that came as an affront, a personal affront, to the man who ran the biggest of the 3 weekly newspapers in the town at that time. He was also someone who thought that women had no place whatsoever in the newspaper business, and he published an item that my grandmother could quote 50 years later verbatim. He said, this was in October of 1916, he said, "A woman has become proprietor of the Greenville Democrat. This newspaper will not be alive when the roses bloom." And my grandmother, with deep satisfaction, would then say, I heard this story many times, as you might expect, she would then say, 4 years later, I owned both the other newspapers. That really wasn't the point. Then she would fix me with a look that I came to appreciate as her sort of, message look. And she would look at me, and then she would say, "And do you know why I owned the other newspapers?" And I'd heard the story, of course, many times, but it was always my part to say, "No, why? And she would say, "Because they were drunk and I was sober." She was a great lady. The thing is, I am a traditional newspaper guy, and so I look at newspapers as newspapers in a traditional sense. But by saying that, I do not mean, for instance, that newspapers should not enter the digital age. They have to. Of course they must. And newspapers like the New York Times have the most robust of online presences. I prefer a newspaper on paper. I know that many, many young people never read a newspaper that way, and that's okay. That's not my problem and not my issue. I don't think, though, that newspapers on paper are going to disappear anytime soon, because the revenues that newspapers get still are sufficient under even these terrible circumstances to allow most of them to at least make an operating profit. The ones that are in bankruptcy are ones that have gotten in debt trouble for the most part. But the revenue that newspapers get from their print advertising is what keeps them as businesses still able to function. So I don't look for the print version to go away anytime quickly, but eventually it will. And when that happens, it happens. The point that I'm trying to make is that my issue is with a news reporting capacity, a set of values, and the ability to deliver that news in a way that will have an impact and not simply be lost in the increasingly gigantic, maelstrom of what's online. Because what's online now includes so very much that unless you're able to deliver your message in a way that, manages to penetrate that clutter and grab the attention of people who are living in a particular area. And we live digitally everywhere without geography, but we also live geographically. You live in a town, you live in a state. And for the most part, that place and that state and that town have a lot more to do with how you live your life and what's important to you and your family than anything else. That is something that is in great jeopardy, as I see it. The way I define newspaper is on print and online. The way I define news, however, is something that can come from any number of sources, and including startups and nonprofits and any number of other things. I think that the issue I have with newspapers is my own concern about a legacy, but also something that I believe is an important thing to keep as an institution if we can. But if we can't, it's more important that we keep that ability to report news, keep those values, and an ability to deliver the news in a way that's compelling and will call attention to factual information and not just hot air.
I want to ask you one or two more questions and then open it up and listen to questions.
Okay.
And I'm sure there will be many from the audience. One of the questions drills a little bit more deeply into some of the values that you identified in your opening statement and that you talk about in the book. And I wanted to address objectivity a little bit more in particular because, as you point out, there is something of a debate going on in the news business now about what do we mean by objectivity? Is objectivity passé as a value? Is it achievable? Should we be bothered about it at all? And I wanted you to talk about that a little bit, if you will.
Well, I'm glad to talk about that because I think that's something important, and I think it's something that is often misunderstood, or at least it's defined in ways that don't square with my way of looking at it. The people who are rightly, I believe, critical of objectivity make a series of arguments. One is that objectivity is impossible because we're all human beings. We all have opinions. We all come to our journalism, in the case of journalists or whatever, with an idea and a point of view. And so the idea that you can come up with some kind of a perfectly objective, truthful, idea of what the reality and what the truth is unrealistic and is impossible. In fact, there is this idea of an objective truth. I mean, it's not something that anyone can define and no one can therefore claim. At the same time, critics of objectivity also point out that objectivity has been evolving into something that is more like he said, she said balance, which is a kind of a phony objectivity as far as I'm concerned. But let me talk about the abstract issue first, because I think one of the biggest problems with objectivity is that it's misunderstood as something that is a journalistic value that could have a subtle meaning. Objectivity is based on the premise not that journalists should be objective or are objective, but that they are not objective. The whole idea of objectivity is calculated to be an antidote to that very thing. It was invented as a concept early in the 20th century as a way of trying to wring opinion and prejudice out of journalism by creating what was viewed at that time as a scientific method of journalism. And what they meant by that is this: just as a scientist begins an experiment with an opinion, with an idea of what's going to be the outcome, the journalist approaches a story with that idea in mind. But just as a scientist who is honorable does not let his idea of what's going to happen determine what the outcome is that he reports, a journalist must rely on evidence and must test his opinions and his predilections and his anticipated views of what the truth is against the best evidence that he can come up with. Not a perfect truth, a practical truth. The kind of practical truth that you expect from someone who is advising you on your 401k or your investments. You don't expect that person to be perfect in their views, but you do expect them to level with you and to tell you what they perceive to be the best, based on the best evidence and their best analysis and all the knowledge that they have and all the experience that they have, to tell you what they believe the truth to be, and then allow you to act on that. You don't have illusions that they're God, but you do want them to level with you, just like you want a doctor to. Well, I think that is the kind of objectivity I mean by objectivity. Objectivity that aims for a practical truth, that is based on testing evidence, and that is based on not cooking the books. It's based on an intellectual honesty that says, even if the outcome does not square with my own prejudices or my own belief system even, or my own values, that I have an obligation to the truth to tell it square, to tell it like it is, and not sort of do it as an advocate or as a lawyer. I compare journalists to lawyers sometimes because lawyers are like public relations people. It's an honorable profession, but lawyers are not hired to find the truth. They're hired, just like public advocates are for institutions or individuals, to use as much truth as they can to make an argument. It's a selected truth, and I think we all understand that. Journalists are supposed to do something a little bit different, like scholars. They're supposed to create as much of an objective, straightforward, fact-based, evidence-based truth as they can come up with. That's my idea of objectivity. Phony objectivity is when you basically say, this is the truth that these people say, this is the truth that these people say, I can't say what the truth is, you decide. That's not objectivity as far as I'm concerned. Now, in some cases, there may not be evidence that will declare, reasonably clearly where the weight of the evidence is. I believe that you have to give that kind of fair, weight to both sides of an argument if that's what it is. But if it's not an argument, if it's simply an advocacy position that a small group of people insist on trying to, to make their view comparable to what is the received, belief of qualified evidence and expertise, then I think to represent these things as equal is not objectivity. And I think that's where a lot of people have lost their confidence in the idea of objectivity when they see a kind of phony balance and a phony fairness. I believe in fairness and I believe in balance, but genuine fairness and genuine balance based on evidence, based on saying truthfully to people, leveling with them, this is what the weight of the evidence says, this is what this group over here believes, they believe it despite the weight of evidence. This is objectivity, and that's the kind of objectivity I believe most Americans want, and that's what most Americans, even though they're not confident about the press, that's what most Americans say they want. What we are moving toward, though, is an environment in which that kind of objectivity is disappearing in favor of voice, in favor of subjectivity, in favor of a point of view. I think that objectivity, journalistic objectivity, also has another virtue. It is something that you can complain about, that you can test, that you can say, wait a minute, this is supposed to be objective, but what about this, or what about that? It's something that puts journalists into an accountability that I believe they should have and should be responsible to. If you're not trying to be objective, then if you're not objective, if you're subjective, if you're making an argument instead of journalistically trying to play it straight, you don't have a complaint, because that's not the standard. We're losing that standard, and I think that is a bad idea.
Let me follow up on that just a little bit more, because again, something that you said in the book really resonated with me. I think that as journalists, I think overall we do a clumsy job of dealing with objectivity and as a value when we deal with the public or when we defend it with the public. And one of the faults, I think, is the idea that, as you say, we come to stories or we come to our profession with no baggage whatsoever. And of course, I doubt you would find a mainstream American journalist, for example, who would argue that tyranny is a better form of governance than democracy, or that, public ignorance is far preferable to giving people information they need to make good decisions to empower themselves.
Sure.
Those are strong points of view. Those are values. They are not objective in the sense of, as you say, let's weigh whether tyranny is better than democracy. Journalists, come to their profession in each story with those sort of baseline assumptions. I'm
not troubled by that. I believe that we live in, my approach to these things is not theoretical and idealized. Yes, I'm an American. I believe in freedom of speech. I believe, in democracy. I believe in capitalism. I believe that, unlike the Islamic world, that we should not be ruled by mullahs. I don't feel like you have to defend those things in every article. I think you come with a sort of a cultural basis. I'm at peace with that. But within that frame, there are times when I think that we are letting ourselves too easily off the hook by throwing up our hands and saying objectivity is clearly impossible because you're not giving equal weight to the Muslim sort of view of the world. Let me give you an example of what I consider to be objectivity on display in a way that I really value and I talk about in this book. In the early 90s, there was an effort by people who oppose abortion rights to sort of push back the abortion rights debate in their direction by having Congress try to enact laws that would prohibit a procedure that came to be called partial birth abortion. It was a late-term abortion. It was done in it's a brutal form of abortion in that it's grisly to describe. It involves crushing the head of the fetus and pulling the fetus out of the birth canal. It's something that sounds as gruesome as you can imagine. And there was a belief, I think, on the anti-abortion rights side of the argument that this was something that people in general, even if they were in general support of abortion rights, would go for. The abortion rights people, on the other hand, viewed this as a lever to sort of get a nose under the tent and start rolling back abortion rights in all kinds of areas. And so the two camps that feel very powerfully on this very volatile issue, were starkly opposed. The people who were against abortion rights had statistics, and the people who were for abortion rights had statistics. And the statistics effectively were focused on these issues. The anti-abortion rights people said that this was a procedure that was done a lot. It was done, but basically the people, let me put it this way, the people who were for abortion rights defended this procedure by saying this was only done in extremis when women or the child were in terrible, terrible shape. It was only done late in pregnancies, and it was done very, very infrequently. The people who were against abortion rights said, no, it was done frequently, it was done when the mother was perfectly healthy, and it was not done when the child and the mother were, in grave jeopardy. They all had statistics. They sent them out to the press, and the media, for the most part, I believe, is pro-abortion rights. And so the mainstream press lined up behind the abortion rights side of this argument, cited those statistics, and basically made the argument. Like, for instance, on 60 Minutes, they had these harrowing stories of women in tragic situations where late in their pregnancies they found that the baby was grossly deformed and they had to go through this procedure. And it was something that would tear your hearts out. This was true, but it didn't turn out to be the truth. A reporter, a woman in Bergen, for the Bergen Record in Bergen County, New Jersey, decided to do some reporting. And so she started calling up abortion doctors in New Jersey, and she found out that, in effect, in New Jersey alone, there were more of these procedures done than Planned Parenthood had said were done in the nation, that they were done throughout throughout a pregnancy, and they were done in many cases, where the woman was not in jeopardy, nor was the child. In other words, everything that was true was on the opposite side of this argument from the one where she personally had her own political perspective. But she did what the objective journalist should do. She told it straight. She told it straight, even though she knew that it would damage her side of the argument. And it did, because her arguments and her reporting was taken up by the anti-abortion people. But she basically said the chips had to fall where they may, because that was where the truth was. And a doctor, David Brown, at the Washington Post, a medical doctor who's also a reporter, he started doing his own reporting, and he found the same thing, and he also reported it in the Washington Post, even though the Washington Post was editorially against changing the law and forbidding this form of abortion. Now, the reason I tell you that story is that I think sometimes people believe that objectivity is something that is a convenience, is something that you tell straight when it suits you, and that you basically hedge your bets and shave the truth when it doesn't. That's not my idea of objectivity. My idea of objectivity is what this woman, who believed something completely the opposite, reported because she was a journalist and doing a job that she felt she had an obligation to the truth to report. That's what I want preserved.
Let me ask one more thing, and then we'll turn it over to the audience. You rightfully point out in the book the challenges facing the news industry and how the changing economic model is really putting pressure on a lot of news outlets. And of course, the stories that we read and hear about are very high-profile cases. Talk about, since your roots are there, and I know some in our audience are from there as well, community journalism for a moment. Is community journalism healthy?
No. I mean, newspapers like ours are having a terribly difficult time. I mean, we're having a very hard time, but we're surviving. I mean, we're surviving. But we had layoffs for the first time in our history during this period. This is a really bloody time for newspapers. There's no question. But I think newspapers as businesses will survive. What I'm worried about, though, is something that happened in the latter part of the 19th century when newspapers became a business. Until then, newspapers were, they were supported by political parties or labor unions or other parties of interest. They were not really businesses because you couldn't make any money at it. It was too cumbersome, it was too difficult, it was too expensive. But then technology in the 19th century provided for the creation of the newspaper business. First came the invention of the telegraph, which created news as we think of it today, because it collapsed the barriers of distance and time. It allowed you to find out what happened in Washington if you lived in Lexington almost instantaneously. When that happened, it was an incredible change in the world we live in. and created a whole idea of news being something that you could find out about relatively quickly and was indeed new, really new. Then came things like innovations like steam presses and rotary presses that were capable of manufacturing newspapers in quantity and quickly. And cheap paper. Paper had been made from cotton, which was quite expensive. But they found a way to make paper from wood pulp, which was much, much less expensive. And they created a linotype machine which allowed automatic typesetting. Typesetting had been done by hand. Every period and space and letter had to be done by hand up until that point. When all these things came together, all of a sudden you could print newspapers quickly and cheaply and in quantity, and you could create, there was an audience and a market for real news, and all of a sudden there was a business here. And in our country, it became a business. It was not something that was taken over by the state, like it were political parties, like it was in some European countries. Our country is a commercial country, and thus newspapers became a business. But it was a very special business because newspapers claimed then, because of the First Amendment largely, they claimed that they had a special role and they had a responsibility. They had a social responsibility to the people who read them. And they made, pledges in their editorial pages, and they promised to, do their work for the public good and in the interests of the public and so forth. And in large measure, they satisfied that promise by giving resources to serious news, by giving resources to cover this iron core of news. That's how they performed that function. And they did it because they felt an obligation to do it, but also because they had a compact with, essentially, with their audiences that they would be allowed to make a good profit from a business provided they continued to do this. Even in those days, though, the market for this kind of news was not necessarily the market that would have sustained it. I mean, think of it. All of us, we're interested in crossword puzzles and the sports page and, the comics and entertainment and whatnot, all kinds of other things. And we buy newspapers to get all kinds of things, not necessarily just for the news. What they found was that they could create a package, and that package was something that they could sell as a package. It included the news, and the people who bought the newspaper for the sports and the comics were effectively subsidizing the news by giving their subscription, and the newspaper was then able to sell advertising around that. That is something that is now, that's now changing. And newspapers are in, jeopardy because that economic model has blown up. Now, as you're trying to find a way to save the newspaper business, what is also in jeopardy, in my opinion, is that commitment that they made to the public back in the 19th century. That commitment that said we will give a disproportionate amount of our resources to supporting this kind of coverage of news. When I say I think that the newspaper business will survive, I believe that. But I don't necessarily think that that commitment to public service in that form will survive. Because the sort of the belief system among newspapers now is that they're becoming more like local television. Local television is based on getting people to watch it. And they don't do anything that is going to drive people away from it. They don't cover politics. They don't cover issues. They don't do investigations. They cover sports and the weather and, features. And they do things that make people feel good, but they basically avoid that stuff that makes people mad. And this kind of stuff is the stuff that makes people mad. Newspapers increasingly are desperately trying to find people to read them, to go to their websites, and doing that means giving people what they want as opposed to what they may need. I think that we're in jeopardy of becoming a newspaper, or seeing a newspaper industry that backs away from this commitment to public service in the form of serious news because it's expensive. And it's not something that a lot of people are even really interested in, even though they will say, if you ask them, that they want somebody to be watching City Hall and they want somebody to be in the State House, they're not necessarily geared to picking up the paper and reading a long investigative piece, but they want somebody to be doing it. Increasingly, newspapers are finding themselves in such economic jeopardy that what they may be doing, I fear may be doing, is becoming these businesses that are focused on giving people what they want, which may be, taking resources away from covering City Hall and the State House and covering T-ball because the grandparents want the picture of the grandchild, and that's something that they will pay for and will go to the site for. I have nothing against T-ball. I know you have grandchildren whose pictures you want to see. I'm all for it. I just don't want those resources to be taken away. That's what I fear. I fear that the newspapers, which have been the guardians and the principal producers of this kind of news, are in danger of saving themselves by becoming something that does not have that as their obligation or sense of their a significant part of their pledge and purpose with the public.